Thank you everyone for joining us on the inaugural forum by Iranian Americans for Liberty. The IAL is a community of Iranian Americans working to strengthen and support U.S. foreign policy. The topic of today's forum is America's Iran policy after the 2020 presidential election in the United States, and I am the discussion moderator, Golsa Sarabi, and we are very privileged to have our two guests joining us from Washington, D.C. today. Mr. Alireza Nader, Senior Fellow at Foundation for Defense of Democracies, and Mr. Michael Pregent, Senior Institute. And today I will ask a series of questions, and there will be plenty of time for all the attendees to ask questions by using the raise hand function. But first, I would like to give our guests an opportunity to briefly introduce themselves.
Oh, great. Okay, I'm Mike Pregent. I've been looking at Iran since 2007, specifically the actions the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has taken in the region, in the Middle East, in North Africa, in Afghanistan. And then I became very involved in the JCPOA debates here in Washington, D.C. in 2015. Former executive director of Veterans Against the Iran Deal. We were veteran intel officers, veterans, special operators, CIA, and also victims of terrorism. And that allowed me to get very intimate with the details of the JCPOA, the Iran deal, and the way the regime was bypassing those things. And it's an honor to be here. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Hi, everybody. My name is Alireza Nader. Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be talking to you about Iran. I work for the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. I'm a senior fellow there focusing on Iran. I spent a lot of my time really looking at what's happening inside of Iran, what the regime's up to inside the country. Before FDD, I was an analyst at the Rand Corporation for 10 years. And before that, pretty much I spent my entire career in U.S. national security, focusing on Iran.
Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure.
So I'm going to start with the first question. The Biden campaign's draft of policy platform was just released, and in it there's a small section with respect to the policy on Iran. This included not pursuing regime change, but does include a return to the JCPOA. Otherwise, Iran nuclear deal. It also mentions continued negotiations on the missile programs and the regime's support for proxy militias. Michael, what are the implications of this policy for the U.S.?
So we can't just jump back into the JCPOA, the Iran deal. And what we're hearing from the Biden campaign, those last 2 points are key, talking about ballistic missiles and regional behavior, because those are two things that are non-negotiables for the regime. The regime was not willing to talk about ballistic missiles when France was trying to get Trump to stay in the JCPOA. They were simply asking for ballistic missiles to be mentioned, and the regime said no. So it's good. It's at least good that the Biden administration, if it comes to pass, will be looking at ballistic missiles and regional behavior, two things that will derail rejoining the JCPOA, because Iran will not do that. The second thing is the president, if he continues, it'll put Iran in a very difficult position, the regime. Maximum pressure is working. It'll bring the regime to the table if Trump wins, but Trump has also set up the Biden administration, if they win, to negotiate from a position of strength. Remember, it was sanctions from the international community and the U.S. that brought Iran to the negotiating table. These sanctions in 2012 crippled the regime. And if you look at maximum pressure now, the regime is far worse off than they were in 2012. They're ready to come to the table. They're hoping they get a Joe Biden so that it'll be easier negotiations in their minds. But I'll tell you this, the 2015 JCPOA debate will be much different in 2021. There is no Obama machine forcing everybody to accept the deal. There is not an Obama regime looking to primary Democrats who don't want to vote for the JCPOA. And because of the failures of the JCPOA, there is not an appetite in DC to simply jump back in, nor will there be an appetite. Like you said, it was a very small section on Iran in the Biden release of its strategy. And because of that, it's not going to be a primary focus of the Biden campaign to use all this political capital to go back into a failed JCPOA where there's so many things to focus on domestically and also with Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. I'll leave it there.
Got it. Thank you so much. Alireza, what are the implications of this policy for the Iranian people?
So those are both great questions, but let me address your first question that Michael also talked about, and I agree with him entirely. As the DNC and the Biden campaign have said, they want to both, they want the US to return to the JCPOA. They believe that the US exit from the nuclear agreement was a big mistake under the Trump administration. And everyone can look at the DNC section on Iran, which I think is just very idealistic and naive. But being politicians, they have to say that. They have to oppose what Trump has done in terms of his foreign policy. But we're in a very different landscape than we were under the Obama administration. First of all, the JCPOA, as far as I'm concerned, is a dead agreement. Some of its key features, for example, the arms embargo against Iran expire in October, November. And the Trump administration is right now pressing the UN Security Council, the P5+1 that negotiated the agreement, to snap back sanctions on Iran, to stop the arms embargo from expiring. But also Iran has undergone 2 major revolts in the last 3 years. I think it's very apparent to anybody in Washington, D.C. who studies and analyzes Iran that the regime is in danger of being overthrown. Has been greatly weakened by sanctions. Its Khamenei regional empire in Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq is under severe stress. The Lebanese economy, for example, is on the verge of collapse, and it could very much take Hezbollah down with it. And I believe even within the Democratic Party, like Michael said, there's less appetite to re-enter JCPOA. Especially a lot of Democrats in Congress will be opposed to merely re-entering the agreement and wasting all the leverage the Trump administration has gained over the regime in the past 4 years. And we're talking about tremendous leverage. So I think that'll be difficult for the Democrats. And I remember when Obama was trying to get the agreement through and getting support from Congress, there were a lot of Democrats that were very much opposed to the original JCPOA. The Obama administration, I remember, had to really strong arm a lot of people, members of its own party. And I just don't think the same dynamics exist anymore. And even some of Biden's key advisor, like Anthony Blinken, have said that we were wrong about sanctions. They've been very effective. And we will renegotiate the JCPOA and use the leverage we have in terms of negotiating with the regime. And also, the Islamic Republic is going to change very much in the next few months. Iran will have a presidential election in June. This so-called fake moderate Hassan Rouhani will be gone. And hopefully, his mendacious foreign minister, Mohammad Javad Zarif, will be gone as well. So I think people in Washington, D.C. who are proponents of negotiating with this regime are going to have a really hard time finding a so-called moderate to negotiate with, because most likely the next president in Iran will be handpicked by Ayatollah Khamenei, who has said that he wants a young, loyal revolutionary. And so the United States might find itself negotiating with somebody like Saeed Jalili, one of the most fanatical members of the regime. And even Wendy Sherman, the chief JCPOA negotiator, has stated that negotiations with people like him were very difficult. Now, in terms of what this means for the Iranian people, I think it'd be very unfortunate if the Biden administration completely ignored human rights in Iran and Iranians' fight for self-determination. Because I do believe that Iran is in a pre-revolutionary stage. And regardless of which party comes to power in the United States, whether it's Biden or Trump, the US should keep its maximum pressure campaign against the Islamic Republic. Secretary Pompeo has laid out 12 points that he wants the regime to make concessions on. And I would add a 13th point to that, and that is self-determination for the Iranian people, including a transition away from the Islamic Republic toward a full democratic system.
Got it. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. As you are aware, there seems to be a discrepancy between the message that this platform sends and statements made by the Biden campaign's senior foreign policy advisor, as you said, Tony Blinken. So what do you think is the reason for this discrepancy? And then I want to ask Michael a question.
I think the discrepancy comes from the fact that, look, the JCPOA was a big political win for the Obama administration. It was supposed to be Obama's chief foreign policy legacy. A lot of people in DC pushed very hard for the JCPOA to go through. I know many of them, they're colleagues, some are friends, despite our disagreement. And a lot of the people who are staffing the current Biden campaign and or his key advisors are really wedded to the JCPOA. They spent a lot of time and effort and sweat negotiating this agreement. And I think they don't like the fact that the Trump administration basically threw it away. And I think really politics has a lot to do with it. The Democratic Party can't come out and say, well, you were right, Trump administration. Maximum pressure is a great policy. Politically, I think that would be difficult for them, especially considering the extreme left of the Democratic Party has very different views on national security. People who call themselves quote unquote progressives really believe that the regime is not so bad, that the US should engage it, and that by exiting the JCPOA, the US has abandoned its allies and become internationally isolated. And so they really believe in the JCPOA, not just in terms of policy, but politics and ideology as well. But again, reality is something very different. You know, if we look at Iran, Iran has changed so much in the last 4 years. Even today, I noticed there are labor strikes in the energy sector. And so every day, the regime is coming under more pressure. And I find it very difficult to believe that the Biden, if there's a Biden administration, that they can reverse 4 years of reality.
True. Thank you. Michael, what are your thoughts about this?
Well, like Ali said, the deal was so bad that even Menendez, a Democrat senator from New Jersey, and Chuck Schumer have said that any future nuclear deal that the United States has, whether it be North Korea or Iran, will have to be a treaty. So you're going to have to get 60 senators to agree on this. And in the JCPOA of 2015, it was a 40 senator threshold. because they wanted it to pass. And one of the biggest advantages we have now is that the president was trying to get a nuclear deal with North Korea, and it put Democrats on record as to what a nuclear deal should look like. No sunset clauses, no sanctions relief before concrete steps, 24/7 access to include U.S. inspections, no sites carved out of a nuclear deal. So I think it's good to hear somebody like Blinken say that we're going to use the leverage that the Trump administration has put in place, because what the Trump administration has done with sanctions and U.S. Treasury has done, you can't simply unravel those. It's not going to be easy to just dismantle those things by fiat or by executive order, because Treasury doesn't work that way. And the thing about it is, even at the end of the Obama administration, when Secretary Kerry was trying to push private sector businesses into Iran, U.S. Treasury was saying, not so fast. If you go in, you're going to be subject to U.S. secondary sanctions. So I'm not worried about the JCPOA. The JCPOA was nothing more than an economic incentive program for China, for Russia, for Europe. And the United States was the only country actually making sure that Iran was in compliance. And the Russians and the Chinese will hold Iran to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. They've mentioned their red lines. They've said the U.S. forced Iran not to comply with the JCPOA, but Iran has to comply with the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So that's where China and Russia get serious about what Iran is doing. And the U.S. has a lot of economic leverage now with China and Russia in this post-COVID-19 world, where both those countries are isolated, where Iran is now thinking about allowing China to come in and just destroy its infrastructure by making it Chinese. They'll make it great, but they'll make it theirs. The 5G towers, and then they'll get all of that for very cheap oil. $400 billion over 25 years is $19 billion a year if it's spaced out that way. But the majority of the money is going to be spent on bringing it into infrastructure, 5G, and basically flooding the Iranian market with Chinese goods and killing that innovative entrepreneurial manufacturing sector that we've seen make microwaves, make cars, make TVs, do all these things. And so it's not the United States that's isolated. Like Ali said, reality is very different from the narratives we're hearing from our colleagues in DC. The reality is that the United States is in a better position now to put pressure on this regime. US sanctions alone have hurt it more than 2012. And China's not going to be a lifeline. China is going to take advantage of the situation. And you hear hardliners opposed to this Chinese deal because they know what's coming, because they've seen the betrayal from Russia, from other countries. So there's some opportunities here.
Thank you so much. Got it.
Sorry for the long answer.
It was great though. Thank you. To both of you, our guests, who do you think is responsible for proposing such policies, and do you believe the hypothetical Biden administration would pursue them?
Who in the Biden campaign do you mean is responsible for the policies? I didn't understand your question, I'm sorry.
Who do you think is responsible for proposing such policies? And do you believe the hypothetical Biden administration would pursue them?
Well, like I said, Anthony Blinken is one of the key figures within the Biden administration. I think people like Wendy Sherman, the negotiator, has a lot of influence. Some other colleagues I've worked with before at the RAND Corporation, who work for different think tanks, also have influence. But again, like Michael said, Biden can't come in to office if he's elected and just reverse everything. He does have a lot of executive authority, and a lot of sanctions can be waived based on executive authority, but we have to remember that the US Treasury Department has designated the entire Revolutionary Guards as a terrorist organization. I have a very difficult time seeing Biden saying, well, no, this is not a terrorist organization. We're going to unwind those sanctions. In addition, right now, the International Atomic Energy Agency is really on Iran's case. The director of the IAEA has demanded that the regime come up with answers regarding 2 undeclared nuclear sites. If you recall, Israeli commanders raided a warehouse in Iran about a couple of years ago, I believe, and they took a lot of documents showing that the regime has been in violation of the nuclear agreement and hiding key aspects. And so the IAEA is going to play a crucial role in holding the Islamic Republic accountable. And even let's say that some of the sanctions against the regime are waived by the Biden administration, a lot of international companies will not want to do business with the regime because it's highly corrupt, has a horrible reputation, and international bodies like the Financial Action Task Force have declared Iran's financial system to be a major concern regarding money laundering and terrorism finance. And I would finally add that in the past couple of months, as we've seen, a series of attacks have taken place against Iran's nuclear facilities and some of its missile sites. And I believe that these attacks will continue for the next few months, at least until Biden takes office if he's elected. And so again, the landscape has changed very much. I think Biden's advisors, in a way, unfortunately, because of the deep partisan divides in our own country, have to come out and say that maximum pressure has been a failure. But if we look at maximum pressure objectively, I think it's been a great success. And you don't have to be a Republican or Democrat to see that. The regime is under the greatest pressure it has ever been. It is running out of dollars. The rial, the currency, is tanking. The stock market in Iran is a bubble that will eventually burst. I don't know when, but that day will come. There will be more strikes and rebellions and insurgencies in Iran. And so I don't think just sitting down with the regime is going to solve any of that. And I really do sincerely hope that our Democratic colleagues see that and act according to US national security and not partisanship.
Thank you so much. Back to Michael. Michael, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, what's interesting about the current situation is under the Obama administration, the Iran team had primacy. The Iran team was the only show in town in the second term of the Obama administration. The first term is about the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare. Second term, it was the JCPOA. Biden's focus is going to be domestic. Biden's focus is going to be AOC's focus. It's going to be a very progressive, far left domestic focus. And his foreign policy team is going to be about wrapping up wars in Iraq, wrapping up wars in Afghanistan. But his China team is going to have primacy. His China team is going to be the ones that it's going to be hard to get the Iran team of 2015 to be anywhere near the status that they had. You know, there's no way they'd even get close to it in 2021. The good thing is colleagues that I know that will go into the Biden administration if Biden wins have basically said, you know, you can't rejoin the JCPOA because it's 2021 and we started it in 2015. By 2028, they can work on ballistic missiles. They'll be able to buy advanced weapons in October if we don't get the arms embargo continued in the UN Security Council. And they'll be able to put a nuclear warhead on top of a ballistic missile in 2032 and still be in compliance with the JCPOA, because that's how bad it was. Now, people like Rob Malley and Blinken will say, no, but we were going to renegotiate those things. I'm like, why would the regime renegotiate? Now, the best thing we have going for us is that the regime was supposed to be in a much different place in 2021. If you go back to 2015, it was supposed to be an economic powerhouse with international investments. It was supposed to be a conventional military threat. It was supposed to be able to work on its ballistic missiles, continue its illicit nuclear program with impunity, and that has not happened, and be in a position to actually negotiate from a position of strength for more concessions. You know, the regime's tactic is provocations for concessions. Instead, it did not become an economic powerhouse. It has not become a conventional military threat. It is hurting to pay militias in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, and in Yemen. It does not have the same status that it had before. Now it is so desperate that it's turning to a predatory lender in China, and it's a big deal. The regime is not where it was supposed to be in 2021. It is desperate, and it's great to hear that our Democrat colleagues know that as well, so they can negotiate something strong. And Chuck Schumer and Menendez are not going to allow this to go forward unless it's a treaty. And the Republicans were not able to hang the Iran deal around Democrats in 2016 and 2020, and that was the goal. It is the goal. It's not anymore. The Iran deal is really not a big deal since the president walked away from it. And it's a good position to be in if you're an American looking to put a good nuclear deal together. It's a very bad position to be in if you simply want to jump back into JCPOA. And it's a very dangerous, not dangerous position, but I'm okay if the regime believes that somehow they're going to get a favorable outcome if Biden becomes president, because the political appetite in DC is not one that's going to bend and allow something that's weak to pass, and something that advantages a more isolated regime based on its actions over the last 5 years.
Got it. Thank you so much. Actually, I have the next question for you as well. There were a couple of columns published after the Biden campaign announced its draft policy platform, specifically in relation to Iran. One of them was by Balagosh from Bloomberg, and it essentially suggests the Biden campaign is out of touch with reality when it comes to Iran policy. Do you agree with that? Why or why not?
I think the experts are well aware of what's needed to be done on Iran. Right. Experts that would be in the Biden administration. The problem is the politicization of everything. It's almost like you have to do the exact opposite of what the president is doing in order to have a platform. So the president's doing maximum pressure, you're supposed to release that. And you have arguments in DC. I disagree with all of them. I do agree that the Biden political campaign is out of touch. And I'm hoping the experts reach out and touch it and fix it. But the regime is in a place now where it has actually hurt itself, but based on its actions it's taken under the Trump administration. But also remember, it embarrassed the Obama administration on a daily basis. Right. When we were in the JCPOA, the regime acted like all sanctions were lifted, like Qasem Soleimani could do whatever he wanted to. They built new militias. They propped up Assad. They brought Russia in. They violated every existing UN Security Council resolution in broad daylight while claiming they were adhering to the JCPOA in the shadows. So the regime has been exposed, and there's not an appetite to re-engage it, and there's certainly not an appetite to re-engage it with the full-on political capital of a first-term Biden administration.
Got it. Thank you so much for that. My next question is for Alireza. Alireza, there was an op-ed in Newsweek magazine written by two people who are currently present as attendees in this. I don't know whether you had the opportunity to read the column or not, but they asserted that a return to the JCPOA or the Iran deal by a hypothetical Biden administration is not feasible. The way they worded it was a return to the JCPOA or forging a new deal with the Iranian regime is not, it's not only impractical, but it's impossible. Do you agree with them? Why or why not?
Yes, I thought that was a very good article in Newsweek, actually, and a very good argument as to why the JCPOA is dead. I think one thing the Biden administration may do is make some interim agreements with the regime in Iran, kind of a freeze for freeze. If they freeze certain aspects of the uranium enrichment program, for example, the US might release some funds. So I think that renegotiating the agreement or having a JCPOA2 will be exceedingly difficult. But I do not believe that the Biden administration will give up on engagement with the Islamic Republic completely. Already, if we listen to some of Biden's key advisors like Jake Sullivan, they're eager to re-engage the regime. And Jake Sullivan was a key advisor to Hillary Clinton, and he was the person who started negotiating with the regime secretly during the Obama administration. So I think the Biden administration will explore diplomatic engagement because diplomatic engagement is the key pillar of the Democratic Party's foreign policy. It has positioned itself as an quote unquote, anti-war, anti-interventionist party. And so they will explore those options. But again, I think it's going to be very difficult. And perhaps the biggest reason it's going to be difficult is the Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, who has said repeatedly that he does not trust either parties, whether Democrats or Republicans. He has in fact said that the US is engaged in a soft war campaign against the regime. And he fears that particularly from the Democratic Party. And Khamenei has also seen that what he used to call heroic flexibility, in terms of engaging the US and changing the regime's tactics has not worked. He believed the POA was a complete failure, that the Rouhani administration's approach was a failure. And so I think he's going to be very reluctant to re-engage. I would not want to be one of the US negotiators, frankly. I think that's almost an impossible, frustrating job. And I wrote a piece recently, an article, making the argument that whether Biden or Trump are president, can any of them seriously engage the regime diplomatically and offer sanctions relief as Iranians are being slaughtered on the streets? I don't think any party can ignore reality. And because the Democratic Party maintains, ostensibly anyhow, that it cares about human rights, it's going to be very difficult for any president to ignore the regime's crimes against humanity. And I think this is where Iranian Americans especially should play a key role and pressure their representatives and lobby their representatives from either party to pay very close attention to human rights in Iran. Human rights in Iran must be a key part of any future negotiation between the United States and the Islamic Republic.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So we are going to take some questions now that are going to be submitted by the audience. In the meantime, we had some polls. There were 3 questions that I want to share the results of the polls with everyone here. So the first question was, who do you think will win the 2020 presidential election, and Donald Trump, 80% of people said Donald Trump, 20% said Joe Biden. And the second question was, do you think that the JCPOA is salvageable for another administration? And 8% said yes, 72% said no, and 20% said maybe. The third question is a very interesting question. It was, which US city has the most Persian cuisine and the authentic cuisine? And LA got 84%, 0% for Houston, Texas. Long Island, New York was 0%. Washington, D.C. was 0%, and they are all on, in authentic was 16% of people who voted. So that was interesting. And I'm just waiting to receive the question that were submitted by the audience. In the meantime, do you have any comments that you would like to share?
Well, LA definitely has the most authentic Persian cuisine in the United States.
Yes.
Of course, in California, so I'm biased, but I think that's an obvious answer. In terms of who will win the U.S. presidential election, I'm not going to make a prediction. But I will say that I'm a proponent of maximum pressure, and there's no reason that if the Democratic Party doesn't win, that it can't maintain maximum pressure on the Islamic Republic. I think both parties should be much more open-minded and really considerate of the future of Iran, because it's a very important and strategic country, and major changes are happening there and are going to happen. Historic changes will happen in Iran in the next few months, if not years. I know a lot of Iranian Americans, including a lot of my friends, frankly, support Trump and want him to be reelected because of the Iran issue. But I don't think the equation is so black and white. I don't think if Trump loses, that the Islamic Republic necessarily wins. I think the Islamic Republic is a loser. It will lose ultimately, and I think it will be defeated. And I think it will be defeated by the Iranian people more than anybody in Washington, D.C.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Michael, so what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that Americans would love to get back to not liking the president from the comfort of a good economy and a law and order society. So I think the beautiful thing about the American vote is it's secret. You can say anything before you vote, and then when you go in, there's a result that takes place. And 2016 surprised everyone, and I believe 2020 will surprise those that are looking at the current polls, just because the COVID-19 issue has devastated the US economy, the protests, things like that. People want to return to some sense of normalcy. And if we listen to what the Biden campaign is talking about, it's not about returning to a good economy and a law and order society. It's about caving to the left on a lot of these social domestic issues. And that's why I believe that if the Biden administration wins, it'll be so focused on domestic issues that it might actually be constrained in conducting serious foreign policy, anything tangible. So we'll see.
We'll see. So I have a question for you. Actually, there are a couple of them together from the audience. What do we know about the deal with China, and what are its impacts? Also, has China done similar deals with Venezuela?
So real quick, this initial deal was talked about in 2016. Again, Iran was supposed to be somewhere else. Supposed to be in a better position, an economic powerhouse. This is now China's attempt to rescue a bad investment. And in that, it's simply to build up their Belt and Road Initiative. They'll build up infrastructure, but they'll mirror it on Chinese infrastructure. They'll build up the 5G towers and mirror it on China's 5G towers. It'll basically be a way for China to use Iran. They're also jumping into Iraq. They're also jumping into Syria. So we've seen the Russians and the Chinese tilt into the Middle East as the US says, we're going to go focus on Russia and China outside of the Middle East, which is actually making us refocus. So the China deal is bad. I mean, I think I'll defer to the audience and I'll defer to Ali, but I've heard, language from both, I'll put it in quotation, reformists and hardliners, that it's a bad deal, that you can't take this deal because it will subjugate Iran's economy to a predatory Chinese economy. A $17 trillion economy will own Iran's $400 billion economy. So one of the questions was about, does this make China, Iran a superpower in the region? No, China's not going to help Iran seize oil tankers in the Strait of Hormuz. China's very pragmatic. They'll sell military equipment, but they'll also constrain the use of that military equipment if it jeopardizes international shipping lanes. China wants an investment. It wants cheap oil, and it wants to benefit if the oil goes up. But it's going to be held accountable for the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps' Navy's actions in the Strait of Hormuz. So this is not we got a great superpower behind us that will help us take over the Middle East and will help us shut down the Strait of Hormuz. No, this is a predatory country that's going to ravish Iran's economy. And the United States will be able to use Iran with leverage with China, where China will probably leverage its position with with Iran to get concessions from the US. So it becomes a pawn, but Iran doesn't win anyway. And that's what I see. I'm not worried about them getting Chinese equipment, because if you want one drone to work, you have to buy 3 Chinese drones. You have to use 2 for parts to make sure one flies. We're not worried about that capability. We are always concerned about what the Quds Force is doing, the Revolutionary Guards and the militias. They're more destabilizing than Iran's conventional military will be allowed to be. And again, China has great relations with Saudi Arabia, with Israel. It's dipping into Egypt. It's dipping into the UAE. These economies are stronger than Iran's. They're not being sanctioned by the international community and by the United States. So China's pragmatic. China sees a desperate borrower and is going to take advantage of the situation. And that should be enough for Iranians to push back regardless of where they stand, whether they're pro-regime or anti-regime. But this is a bad move for Iran.
Absolutely.
Just really quickly on that, I believe that the Rouhani administration is so desperate for a win that it came up with this so-called great agreement with China. I'm very skeptical about what's been reported on it. I don't think China is going to invest $400 billion in Iran. Chinese companies have really abided by US sanctions. China-Iran trade is dramatically down. And I think the Rouhani administration wanted to give an impression to the Iranian people and also the media in the United States and policymakers in the United States that it had defeated maximum pressure by moving closer to the Chinese. I don't think anything big is going to come from this as long as US sanctions remain. If any Chinese companies want to trade with Iran, they will be sanctioned. There's no way around it. And they will lose access to the US financial market. So who are you going to choose, Iran or the United States? I don't think it's a very difficult decision. I will say this though, the secret agreement is extremely unpopular in Iran. It is viewed as a sellout of Iran's sovereignty, quite rightly, to communist China. I know that anti-Chinese sentiment is very high in Iran right now, especially because of COVID-19, because we know that COVID-19 came directly from China to Iran on, for example, Mahan Airlines, which is run by the Revolutionary Guards. So if the Rouhani administration thought it was going to win, I think actually it really shot itself in the foot because Iranians are very angry about this, and every day the regime does something to make them angrier. And I think ultimately this will rally Iranians to the flag even more than before.
Got it. Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing that. So we have one of our attendees that he has a question. Hi, Reza, can you hear me?
Yeah, Olivia. Thanks.
Hi. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you both for joining us in such a great discussion and providing your insight. I want to make a comment, and as one of the authors of the article that Gosa referred to in Newsweek that we published about a couple of weeks ago regarding why it is nearly impossible to go back to the JCPOA or enact a new deal with the regime. And one of the things that is constantly being ignored, and Alireza alluded to this, and which will profoundly affect whether or not any administration can engage in any form of negotiation with the regime, are the elections in Iran in 2021. Right now, we know that the Majlis or the so-called parliament is completely in the hands of a faction that's been labeled as the hardliners in Iran, and they're no fan of the JCPOA, and further and beyond that, they're no fan of negotiation with any Western country over any concessions to be made by the regime. Now, this factor seems to be concealed for some reason. And it is a very, very pressing factor. And I believe that some of the pro-regime groups in Washington, D.C. are responsible for that, to provide a mirage that the so-called reformist camp in Iran is a perpetual power in Iran. And I want to get Michael's take on this. How effective, if hypothetically Biden becomes president, these groups that we very well know, and names need not be mentioned, how effective do you think they will be in persuading the Biden administration towards a policy of regime appeasement as they did in 2015? Thank you.
Thanks for the question. I don't think NIAC is going to be effective. As effective as it was. It hasn't been as effective since Trita Parsi left. Trita Parsi's focused on other things. Trita Parsi's also, somebody that the Biden administration will probably already realize, hey, listen, we got his position already. It's a known position. He's not going to be able to tell us anything new. Everything has changed now. Everything has changed. The regime has disappointed. It's disappointed Europe, it's disappointed the United States, it's disappointed the IAEA. So I think the strongest voices in the administration are going to be from other Democrats. We have to remember something that happened a couple of weeks ago. 400 members of the House of Representatives said that they supported the arms embargo staying in place so that Iran could not buy equipment. For the first time ever, the Nancy Pelosi Democrat-led House is preventing, it allowed 2 amendments to pass that prevent any US money from touching any Iraqi institution where Iran's militias have access to, the Border Corps, the Quds Force. And that's a big deal. And the Senate is likely to pass that in the coming, the next 30 days or so. There will be people that will try to stop it, but the more we put a spotlight on human rights abuses, militia attacks, the protesters across the land bridge that Qasem Soleimani built, the more Democrats are agreeing that yeah, we should do something about this. So there is some bipartisan support. They just may not know that they agree. So let's not tell them that they're in agreement here. Let's let this continue.
I think you're absolutely right, Reza, and Michael is right as well. Look, Zarif, the foreign minister, has lost a lot of credibility, even among Democrats. I would venture to say even in Europe. And more likely than not, he's not going to be foreign minister after Rouhani is replaced by an even more fanatical figure, whether it's Saeed Jalili or one of these, so-called younger revolutionaries. And I think the narrative has changed quite a bit in DC in the last 4 years. This narrative of moderate versus hardliners has been shattered. I don't hear people making that argument very much anymore. I think anybody who does so is just embarrassing himself or herself, especially after so many Iranians were slaughtered in November of last year. How can you say a regime is moderate when it slaughters its own people? And so I think there has been a major change. I would caution Iranian Americans, though, not to be passive. I think this is a time when our community should be loud, polite, but loud. And we should make ourselves heard, especially when it comes to members of Congress. And we should really emphasize human rights in Iran. Look at this regime. It's the most misogynistic, homophobic, anti-environment, anti-labor, anti-human regime on the planet, or one of them anyways. And so, we can't let Zarif and his supporters try to dominate the narrative again. I think this is a crucial role the Iranian American community should play, regardless of who wins, whether Trump or Biden wins. We have to be loud.
True. Thank you so much. I would like to appreciate your time today, both of you. And I would like to ask if there's any closing comments that you would like to share with us before we leave.
Yeah, the most important thing that we can do between now and the election is to have Iranian Americans tell their representatives what's going on in Iran, especially the human rights stuff. Engage with Democrats about human rights. Engage with Democrats on anti-gay, detain, they detain people for being homosexual. They punish people for thinking a different way. They tell women you can and can't do this. Focus on those issues that Democrats care about, because it resonates. Stay away from the nuclear stuff. Stay away from the terrorism. Focus on the human rights abuses. Focus on the hijab. Focus on, tell them how many artists we haven't heard from yet. How many artists do we not know in Iran? How many poets? How many musicians? How much talent has been constrained and quieted by a regime that believes it owns Iran's history? This regime has only been around for 40 years, yet it thinks it owns Iran's history. It does not, and the world needs to be reminded of that.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
I just want to thank you for inviting me. I'm really happy to see Iranian Americans organize and become politically active. I think for too long, the Iranian American community has shied away from politics, and we really need to change that. We can't just, forget Iran and leave Iran behind and pursue just a great life here. To me, that is not personally fulfilling, because I think every Iranian in the United States owes a debt of gratitude toward Iran and should really fight for Iranian culture and history, and for really the freedom of Iranians back home. I think it really matters, and I think the next few months will be very crucial.
Absolutely. Thank you so much to both of you for joining us today. Thank you for your time. Thank you for everyone who attended the Iranian Americans for Liberty's inaugural forum. Please join us for future discussions, and don't forget to follow us on Twitter as well. And it's been my honor to be with all of you today, and I wish you an amazing weekend. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Thank you.